Welcome, deep divers. Today, we're really getting into something fascinating. We're looking beyond horror just being, cheap thrills.
Right. More than just cinematic junk food.
Exactly. We're going to unpack why it feels vital, maybe even healthy, which sounds weird to say.
It does, but there's a lot there.
So our mission today is to explore, why do we actually like being scared? And how does being a horror fan maybe set you up differently for real life?
And also how the genre acts as a kind of social critic, right? Pushing boundaries in
Yeah.
ways other films maybe can't or won't.
Yeah, exactly. And we've got insights from someone who really knows this stuff, both the screen scares and the societies that kind of dream them up. Are ready to dive in.
Let's do it. It really starts with that big counterintuitive question, doesn't it?
Which is,
Why on earth would anyone choose to be scared? Fear is unpleasant, generally speaking, so why seek it out?
that is the puzzle, isn't it? We line up for experiences that should logically repel us. What's going on in our heads when we're watching, I don't know, Jason Voorhees on screen?
Well, it's pretty amazing, actually. It's how our biology and psychology are sort of wired. When you see that threat, Jason's machete, whatever your brain's alarm system, the amygdala, it doesn't really pause to check if it's real.
Does off.
Instantly. It basically hails danger
Yeah.
and floods your system. You get adrenaline, cortisol, your heart starts pounding, you breathe faster, muscles tense up. You're physically ready to fight or run.
All while sitting on the sofa.
Exactly. All while holding popcorn.
Yeah.
But here's the really clever bit. Almost at the same time, the front part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex,
Ah.
that's the rational bit.
The grown-up in the room.
Huh? Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
It pipes up and says, hang on, it's okay, you're safe. That's just pixels.
So there's a conflict.
Well, it's more like a sequence.
Yeah.
You get that massive biological fear response, the adrenaline rush, without the actual danger. And once your brain gets the all clear signal, that adrenaline gets followed by endorphins, dopamine,
Ah, the good stuff.
the really good stuff.
Yeah.
It creates this feeling of euphoria,
Yeah.
relief, like you've conquered something, you faced the monster and won.
So the whole process is like a practice run.
That's a perfect way to think about it. It's a form of stress inoculation. You're literally practicing being afraid, learning how your body reacts, and crucially, learning that the feeling passes.
That's fascinating. So it's like building emotional muscle memory. Does that practicing actually translate? I mean, how does watching a scary movie help when something genuinely bad happens in real life?
It really seems to. It's like an emotional gym. This isn't just your brain having a weird kind of fun. It seems to build real resilience. There was actually a study in 2020 by Colton Scrivener at the University of Chicago.
Oh, yeah. What did it find?
It found that people who regularly watched horror films, and also people just generally described as morbidly curious, actually showed greater psychological resilience during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Wow. Okay, that is counterintuitive. Fictional scares helping with a real global crisis.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, there are a few layers to it. First, just like we said, horror gives you a safe zone to feel really intense negative emotions. Fear, anxiety, disgust, even despair.
Things we usually try to avoid feeling.
Exactly. But a horror fan walks into that gym regularly. They work out those feelings. So when a real crisis hits, a pandemic, losing a job, whatever, they've got a better toolkit maybe. They've felt that spike of anxiety before. They know it peaks, but it also fades.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Second, real trauma is often just chaotic. It doesn't make sense. There's no story to it. Horror movies, though, almost always give you a narrative. There are usually rules, even if they're weird rules.
Like, don't go in the basement.
Right, or don't read from the creepy book. And very often, you get the final girl.
Ah, yes, the final girl. Resourceful, tough.
Yeah.
The one who makes it.
Exactly. She figures things out. She fights back. She imposes some kind of order on the chaos. Watching that gives you a sort of psychological blueprint. It's vicarious practice in finding control when everything feels out of control.
So the final girl is more than just a trope.
Oh, absolutely. Carol J. Clover wrote brilliantly about this. The final girl isn't just a victim who gets lucky. She's observant, adaptable, resilient. She often uses the killer's own tools against them. For anyone who's faced real trauma, she's a powerful symbol of endurance,
Yeah, I can see that. A model for survival.
And horror fans see that story arc play out again and again. It internalizes this narrative. Survival is possible, even against the odds. That's a powerful thing to carry into real-world difficulties.
Okay, so it preps us personally. But you also mentioned horror as a social mirror. How does a genre that's often dismissed as, schlocky manage to say important things about society?
This is where it gets really interesting, I think. Horror often functions as society's subconscious. It's id, maybe.
Yeah.
It takes all those collective anxieties, the things we're afraid to talk about openly, and gives them monstrous form.
So the monster isn't just a monster.
Rarely. It usually represents something. And because of that, horror fans get really good at reading metaphor, at digging into subtext. They're sort of primed to handle controversial topics because they're used to looking beneath the surface.
Can you give some examples? How has it reflected the times?
Oh, definitely. Think back to the 1950s, Cold War paranoia. You get Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Is it just about aliens?
Mm.
Or is it about McCarthyism, the fear that your neighbor, your friend, could be replaced by a soulless conformist?
Right. The enemy within.
Exactly. Then jump to the late 60s, early 70s, Vietnam, civil rights turmoil, George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. The zombies are scary, sure, but the real horror, it's the people trapped in the farmhouse turning on each other, the breakdown of trust.
And that ending. Powerful stuff.
Incredibly powerful, especially casting a black actor as the hero who then gets shot by a white posse. Or look at the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That captured this post-Vietnam, post-Watergate feeling of disillusionment, a really gritty, nihilistic view of America falling apart.
Okay, what about the 80s, the slasher era? That seemed more straightforward, maybe.
On the surface, yeah. But you can definitely read the slasher boom as a kind of backlash against the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s. The rules were pretty clear, weren't they?
Have sex, die. Do drugs, die.
Right. The virgin survives. It's this really harsh, conservative morality play reflecting the anxieties of that Reagan era.
Then more recently.
Well, we've seen the rise of the social thriller. Jordan Peele's Get Out is a masterclass, dissecting that specific kind of liberal racism that pretends race isn't an issue anymore.
While being terrifying.
Absolutely. Or films like Hereditary or The Babadook. They aren't just ghost stories. They're brutal explorations of grief, of generational trauma, the unspoken horrors and pressures of motherhood.
So someone else might just see a monster, but a horror fan sees layers?
Pretty much. A non-fan might watch Get Out and just think, wow, scary movie about a messed up family. The horror fan is thinking about the commodification of black bodies, about microaggressions becoming literal threats. They're just more equipped for those deeper allegorical conversations because the genre has been doing this kind of work for decades.
And maybe sharing that scary experience builds a kind of bond, too.
Definitely. There's a communal aspect. Surviving a terrifying film together, even fictional, builds this sense of we got through that, which absolutely feeds into real-world resilience.
Okay, this is fascinating, but you mentioned it goes even deeper. Something about empathy, especially for the other. That sounds profound for horror.
It really is. I think this idea of empathy for the other might be horror's most subversive gift to its fans. So much of the genre hinges on the other, something outside societal norms. And the default human reaction is often fear, rejection, destroy it.
Get the torches and pitchforks.
Exactly that. But the best horror complicates this. It doesn't just show you the monster. It often shows you how the monster became a monster. It exercises the empathy muscle.
Like who? Can you give us some classic examples?
The most obvious is Frankenstein's creature,
Yeah.
right? He's not inherently evil. He's articulate, intelligent, desperately wants connection.
But he's rejected because of how he looks.
Brutally rejected by his creator, by society. He becomes violent because of that rejection. The real horror isn't the creature. It's the prejudice that made him monstrous. The fan learns, maybe subconsciously, that the monster is often a symptom.
Okay, who else?
Think about King Kong.
Yeah.
Taken from his home, chained up, put on display. His rampage isn't evil. It's a terrified animal striking out.
And that famous last line? 'Twas beauty killed the beast.
Exactly. It places the blame squarely on human greed and ambition. We mourn Kong, or Carrie White. Her powers erupt after just unbearable torment from her mother, from her classmates. We're horrified by her actions, but we also feel horrified for her.
So the horror fan learns to ask why, instead of just pointing and yelling, monster.
I think so, yes. It conditions a different response. When you encounter others in the real world, maybe someone struggling with mental illness, an outcast, someone battling addiction, the non-fan's reaction might be fear or judgment. Crazy. Dangerous.
But the horror fan.
The horror fan's instinct, honed by all those sympathetic monsters, is maybe more likely to be, what happened here? What's the backstory? What pain led to this? It shifts the baseline from condemnation towards curiosity, maybe even compassion. And they definitely recognize that torches and pitchforks mob mentality when they see it in real life.
Yeah.
And they're probably more skeptical of it.
Does this carry over into bigger things? Like politics? Does it make fans resistant to certain kinds of language?
I believe it can have significant implications there. So much of politics involves defining a U.S. and a them and other. When political figures or media start using monstrous language, calling groups animals, vermin, and infestation,
That happens.
the horror fan hears alarm bells. They've seen this movie before. They know that dehumanizing a group, painting them as monsters, is step one towards justifying terrible actions against them. They recognize the rhetoric of the scared villager whipping up the mob, not necessarily wise leadership.
So it makes them more critical of that kind of speech.
Potentially, yes. And the sympathetic monster narrative also teaches that the problem is rarely just the individual monster. Frankenstein's creature exists because of Victor's hubris and society's prejudice. So, a horror fan might be more inclined to look at systemic issues behind problems like crime. Instead of just lock them up, maybe they ask about poverty, education, systemic racism.
Looking for the making of the problem, not just the problem itself.
Exactly. It might foster a viewpoint that's naturally skeptical of concentrated power and maybe more aligned with marginalized groups, because the genre so often sides with the outcast, the misunderstood.
But hang on, not all monsters are sympathetic, right? What about Michael Myers? Or the xenomorph from Alien? You can't really empathize with them.
That's a crucial point. And it doesn't contradict the empathy idea, it actually complements it. Those kinds of monsters, the relentless, unknowable evil, teach a different but equally important lesson.
Which is?
That some threats can't be reasoned with. Some things are just dangerous. This builds a healthy sense of caution, of preparedness. So the horror fan's worldview becomes this interesting mix. Try to understand the humanity in the monster, but also be ready for the monster that has no humanity.
A kind of moral flight simulator.
That's a great analogy. It simulates these complex moral and emotional scenarios. It teaches that monsters are often made, not born, and that maybe the most monstrous act of all is dehumanizing someone else.
That is powerful. And speaking of simulations, you said horror demands critical thinking, but not the neat, tidy kind. You called it messy.
Yeah, because real critical thinking is messy. It's not about polite debate club points. It's about grappling with uncomfortable truths, dissecting things we're told not to touch, looking straight at the ugly parts of ourselves and society. Horror doesn't just permit that, it requires it. It's like an intellectual abattoir, maybe, where you can take forbidden ideas apart.
Forbidden ideas? Like what?
Well, every society has its taboos, right?
Yeah.
Things we're scared to really examine. The fragility of our bodies, the fact that our minds aren't always reliable, the potential for social collapse. Families being not safe havens, but sources of pain, meaningless death. These are the intellectual no-fly zones.
And horror flies right into them.
Crashes into them usually. It's a sanctioned space to violate those taboos.
Yeah.
It's that controlled demolition idea again. Because you know it's a movie, you have psychological permission to engage with stuff that would normally make you recoil. And that recoil is the enemy of critical thinking. You can't analyze what you refuse to look at.
So how does it actually use these taboos as tools for thinking?
It uses a few key tools.
Yeah.
One is the extremity test. Horror takes an idea or a fear and pushes it to its absolute, logical, often grotesque conclusion.
Like The Purge taking political anger to its ultimate expression.
Exactly. The fan has seen the nightmare endpoint. So in a real debate about political dehumanization, they're not just reacting emotionally, they're analyzing the rhetoric against this imagined worst-case scenario. They can see the potential trajectory.
Okay, what's another tool?
The autopsy of an idea. Horror dissects concepts, literally and figuratively. Think about motherhood again. Mainstream might say, it's hard but beautiful. Films like The Babadook or Hereditary perform a brutal autopsy. They show the grief, the resentment, the inherited trauma, the monstrous feelings that are real but unspeakable. You give the fan a vocabulary, a visual language, for these dark corners of human experience.
And the third tool?
Inversion of norms. Horror loves to take a cherished social norm and flip it completely inside out. That forces you to question why the norm exists. Back to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The family unit normally sacred is the engine of horror. They're tight-knit, loyal, and cannibals.
So it makes you ask what really makes a family good?
Precisely. Is it just sticking together, or is it about the values they uphold? The fan becomes skeptical of simplistic appeals to family values and asks the more critical question, okay, but which values?
This all sounds like it would make horror fans formidable debaters.
I think it does. It builds a unique skill set. First, emotional acclimatization. They can sit with discomfort. When a tough debate gets heated, they're less likely to shut down emotionally. They can often separate the feeling from the argument.
They've handled worse, fictionally speaking.
Kind of, yeah. They also develop fluency in the language of the underbelly. They have frameworks and words for discussing society's darker aspects, and maybe most importantly, they develop resistance to moral panics. Horror is often the target of those panics, so fans get very good at spotting illogical, fear-based arguments.
So, for a really tough topic, like bodily autonomy, how does horror help?
That's a perfect example. Bodily autonomy is central to so many charged debates. Abortion, vaccine mandates, trans rights. Someone avoiding taboos might see it in simple black and white. But the horror fan, their mind instantly accesses this huge library.
Cronenberg's body horror, Rosemary's Baby, Alien.
Silence of the Lambs on identity and flesh.
Yeah. They've got this portfolio of messy, terrifying, deeply human stories about what it means to control or lose control of your own body. They're better equipped to handle the complexities, the moral gray areas, the visceral reality of it all.
So horror teaches you not to be fearless, but brave. Exactly. Be brave enough to face the monster, whether it's on screen or a complex societal problem. Looking away doesn't make it vanish. It just lets it fester in the dark.
Okay, so if mainstream movies, like Disney maybe, are often comfort food, sanding off the edges, where does horror fit in the big picture of filmmaking?
It's kind of the opposite. It's the R&D department, the laboratory.
Yeah.
See, horror often works with lower budgets. That sounds like a limitation, but it actually gives creators incredible freedom.
Less money riding on it, less need to please everyone.
Precisely. You're not trying to make $1 billion. You're trying to connect with a specific audience that wants to be challenged, maybe even transgressed against. They come for the dangerous ideas, the stuff you can't see anywhere else.
So it's where filmmakers can really experiment.
Absolutely. They can mix volatile creative chemicals and see what happens. This means horror fans get exposed to a much wider, weirder, often more profound range of ideas than people who stick to the mainstream.
Can you give examples of these unthinkable concepts that horror lets us explore?
Sure, take Hereditary again. The core concept is the monstrous womb. The idea that your family isn't love, it's a genetic or spiritual curse you literally cannot escape. Your
Right.
bloodline is a trap.
Wow. Yeah, you wouldn't see that in a feel-good family drama.
Not a chance.
Yeah.
It's a direct assault on a sacred institution. But for people dealing with generational trauma or abuse, it's incredibly validating. It speaks to that feeling of being trapped by your origins.
Okay, give me another.
How about teeth? The concept is, well, shocking.
Mhm.
Vagina dentata as a literal defense against sexual violation. It links purity culture to dysfunction, weaponizes female anatomy. It's graphic, it's uncomfortable,
Definitely not mainstream friendly.
not even close.
Wow.
But it's this brilliant, visceral allegory about female rage, bodily autonomy, the desire for a body that can fight back against violation. It critiques hypocrisy in a way that's unforgettable.
One more. Maybe something really extreme.
Okay, how about Martyrs? French horror. The concept is hard to even describe. A secret society systematically tortures women to the brink of death, trying to induce a transcendental state to glimpse the afterlife.
That sounds incredibly bleak.
It is. It's maybe one of the most anti-commercial ideas ever filmed.
Yeah.
Brutal, no easy answers, just ambiguity and suffering. But it forces you to confront huge questions. What's the link between extreme pain and spiritual insight? What lengths will humans go to for answers about death?
So watching these films, it's more than just watching. It's a kind of cognitive workout.
A profound one. Think about the cumulative effect. Someone who's processed Hereditary, Teeth, Martyrs. Their intellectual and emotional landscape has been stretched, maybe even reshaped.
They're more flexible, less easily shocked.
I think so. They become more cognitively flexible. They're less likely to be thrown by radical ideas. They can analyze something even if it's presented in a disturbing way, looking for the truth hidden inside the grotesque image. They've basically been trained not to look away when things get difficult or ugly or just plain weird. They know sometimes you have to break an idea down to really understand it.
Right. Okay. So bringing this all together, what does it all mean? We've gone through biology, resilience, social critique, empathy.
It means horror is way more than just scares, doesn't it?
Yeah. It seems like it's this biological hack we use. It's a training ground for our minds and emotions, and it's maybe society's most brutally honest, unfiltered critic.
Well put. Fans are learning, maybe without even realizing it, how to manage fear, how to internalize stories of survival.
And how to engage with really tough societal issues in a way that encourages thinking, not just reacting with fear.
Exactly.
So maybe the final thought for everyone listening is, next time you see someone eagerly heading into the latest slasher flick or creature feature, maybe don't be so quick to judge.
They might just be doing their homework for the real world.
Yeah, preparing for reality, one perfectly timed jump scare at a time.